Imagine the loneliest place a person can stand. A small triangle of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nearest inhabited land is over 1,000 miles away, so far that for most of its history, the people who lived here may have believed they were the only humans in existence. And on the slopes of this island stand the faces. Nearly 1,000 of them. Giant figures carved from stone, some taller than a house, some weighing as much as a fully loaded aircraft. They stare inland, away from the sea, with heavy brows and long ears and tight, unreadable mouths. For centuries, outsiders who stumbled onto this island asked the same impossible question. How did a people with no metal, no wheels, no cranes, and no outside help carve these giants, move them for miles across open ground, and stand them upright? But there is a second question, and it is the one that should keep you up at night. The people who did all of this, who turned a remote rock into one of the wonders of the ancient world, almost completely disappeared. By the time the world started paying attention, they were nearly gone. So what happened to them? You have probably heard an answer. And I'm going to show you why that answer is almost certainly wrong. First, let's give these people their due, because the legend tends to erase how staggering their achievement was. The island was settled by Polynesian voyagers, master navigators who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in wooden canoes, reading the stars, the swells, and the flight of birds, and found a speck of land smaller than many cities. That alone is one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history. And once they arrived, they built a society sophisticated enough to spend generations producing art on a colossal scale. The statues, called moai, were carved from compressed volcanic ash in a quarry on the side of an old crater. Using stone tools, the carvers cut each figure out of the rock face, often lying on its back, refining the features before the giant was ever freed from the mountain. Then came the truly mind-bending part, moving them. Some moai were dragged or, as many researchers now believe, essentially walked, rocked side to side with ropes by teams of people, inching forward in a way that, from a distance, would have looked like the statue was striding across the land on its own. They were set on stone platforms along the coast, and many were topped with a separate cylinder of red stone, like a crown. This was not the work of a dying, desperate people. This was the work of a confident, organized, brilliant society at the height of its powers. Which makes what supposedly happened next so hard to accept. Here is the version most people know. It goes like this. The islanders, obsessed with building ever bigger statues, cut down their forest to move them, using the trees as rollers and levers. Tree by tree, they stripped their own island bare. Without trees, they couldn't build canoes to fish in deep water. The soil eroded. Crops failed. And as starvation set in, this once great society tore itself apart in war, toppling each other's statues, even descending, in the most lurid versions of the tale, into cannibalism. In this telling, the people of the island committed a kind of slow suicide. They consumed their world to feed their own vanity, and when the world ran out, they collapsed. It is a powerful story. It has been told in best-selling books and documentaries as a parable for our own time, a warning about what happens when a civilization destroys its environment and refuses to stop. The island becomes a tiny model of planet Earth, a closed system, used up by its own inhabitants. And as a moral lesson, it is almost too perfect. But that, it turns out, is exactly the problem. Because when archaeologists went looking for the hard evidence beneath this neat little parable, a lot of it simply wasn't there. Let's start with the forest. It's true, the island was once covered in millions of palm trees, and by a few centuries after settlement, they were essentially gone. But here is the detail the legend leaves out. When researchers examined the ancient palm nuts preserved in the ground, many of them showed the gnaw marks of rats. The Polynesian rat arrived with the first settlers, whether as stowaways or as a food source, and on an island with no predators and unlimited food, rats breed explosively. A single pair can become millions in a few years. And they ate the palm seeds. A forest that cannot produce new seedlings is a forest that, over time, quietly dies, not from axes alone, but from a population of rodents devouring the next generation of trees before it can grow. The deforestation, in other words, may have been far less a story of greedy humans and far more a story of an invasive species the humans never intended to unleash. Now the second crack. The starvation story assumes the islanders were helpless once the trees were gone. But the archaeology shows the opposite, a population of ingenious farmers. They developed a technique called lithic mulching, deliberately covering their fields with broken rock, which protected the soil from wind and evaporation, released minerals, and let crops thrive in difficult ground. They built low stone structures to shelter plants from the salt wind. Across the island, archaeologists have mapped thousands of these stone gardens, a vast, deliberate agricultural system stitched into the rock itself. That is not the footprint of a people losing a war against their own environment. It is the footprint of a people winning it, square meter by square meter, with patience and invention. These were not people passively starving in a wasteland. These were problem solvers, adapting cleverly to a harsh home. And the third crack is the most important of all. If a society of many thousands had truly collapsed through mass starvation and constant war, you would expect to find the evidence in the ground, large numbers of remains, signs of violent death, weapons everywhere. But the physical evidence for a massive pre-contact population crash, for widespread warfare, for cannibalism, is thin and hotly disputed. The dramatic war, the self-inflicted apocalypse, much of it may be exaggeration layered on over the years. So if the islanders didn't wipe themselves out before the outside world arrived, then we are left with the real question. What actually entered this island? And the answer arrives on ships. For centuries, the people of Rapa Nui were alone. Then, slowly, the outside world began to find them, and almost everything that followed was a disaster. The first European ship arrived and named the island after the day it spotted it. More visitors trickled in over the decades, and with them came new diseases against which the islanders had no immunity. But the true catastrophe came in the early 1860s. Raiders from the coast of South America descended on the island hunting for one thing: human beings to sell as labor. In a series of raids, they seized enormous numbers of islanders, by some estimates well over 1,000 people, possibly close to half the entire population, and carried them off in chains to work and die in mines and plantations far from home. Among those taken were the island's leaders, its elders, and the keepers of its knowledge, the very people who held the society's memory, its rituals, and quite possibly the ability to read its mysterious written script, a script that to this day has never been fully deciphered, because the people who understood it were stolen. The horror did not end there. Under international pressure, a handful of the captured islanders were eventually sent back. But by then many had died in captivity, and the survivors carried smallpox home with them. The disease tore through the small community that remained. Within a few short years, an island that had once supported many thousands of people had been reduced to a tiny remnant. By some records, only around 110 people survived. Read that number again. From thousands to roughly 100. Not over centuries of slow ecological decline, but in barely a generation, by slavery and disease brought from outside. And think about what that truly costs an island. When you tear away the elders and the priests in a single brutal season, you don't only lose people, you lose the library. The chants that carried the history. The names and meanings of the statues. The key to that undeciphered script. An entire civilization's memory can be amputated in a matter of weeks, and what remains behind looks, to the visitors who come later, like a mystery that no one is left alive to explain. So let's put the two stories side by side, because the contrast is the whole point. In the popular legend, the people of this island are the villains of their own destruction. They were reckless. They were vain. They used up their paradise and paid the price, a cautionary tale about human folly. In the version the harder evidence increasingly supports, they are something else entirely. They are the victims. A resilient, ingenious people who survived for centuries on one of the most unforgiving specks of land on the planet, who solved problems we still admire, and who were then devastated not by their own hands, but by invasion, kidnapping, and plague carried in from the outside. Now ask yourself a harder question. Why was the suicide story the one that spread? Why did we so readily believe that these islanders destroyed themselves? Part of the answer is that it makes a cleaner moral. A people who ruin their own home is a tidy fable we can wag a finger at. But part of it is darker. If the islanders destroyed themselves, then no one else is responsible. The slavers vanish from the story. The diseases vanish. The outside world that actually emptied this island gets to step quietly out of frame, and the victims get blamed for their own near extinction. That is what makes this not just an archaeological debate, but a moral one. The story we tell about how a people died decides who we hold responsible, and for a long time, the story let the real culprits walk away. Here is what I find most haunting of all. The people of Rapa Nui did not actually go extinct. That tiny remnant survived. Their descendants live on the island today, keeping a language and an identity alive against almost impossible odds, which means the vanished civilization framing was never even fully true. They didn't disappear. They were nearly erased, and they endured. So when you picture those giant stone faces now, staring inland across the grass, I want you to see them differently. For years they were sold to us as monuments to human stupidity, the relics of a people who carved their way into oblivion. But that is not what they are. They are monuments to human brilliance, raised by navigators and engineers and artists on the loneliest land on Earth. And the real warning they carry is not the one we were told. The lesson of this island is not simply that a civilization can destroy itself from within. It is that the comfortable story, the neat, finger-wagging fable, can quietly bury the truth and let the guilty escape. The statues kept their secret for a long time. They stared out over the place where it happened and said nothing. It took us far too long to stop blaming the dead and start asking who really arrived on those ships. So the next time someone tells you a simple story about why a great people fell, remember the silent giants, and ask what the tidy version is letting everyone forget. What other they did it to themselves stories do you think deserve a second look? Tell me below.